And thank you very much, Rory. Well, staying in the UK, as elsewhere, the search is on for effective treatments to combat the coronavirus. And in Reading, scientists have turned to a herd of llamas to provide very small antibodies which they believe could neutralise the virus. Our correspondent Jonah Hull has more.
What does a herd of llamas have to do with COVID-19? It's not the start of a joke, but it could be the route to a cure. Barney Jones looks after the animals' welfare.
We have Sunny, we have Toddy, we have Spot, we have Alfie, Oscar, the one sitting down.
And meet Fifi, the star of this particular show.
Fifi is the first llama on the university's farm that we've used in COVID-19 research.
Llamas and other camelid species such as camels and alpacas produce specialised small antibodies different to what you and I produce. So what we do is we introduce a dead COVID or small COVID protein into the llamas, and they produce a natural nanobody response. So they're small antibodies that bind onto the proteins that we introduce.
These pictures from a similar trial with alpacas in Germany show nanobodies binding with the coronavirus protein spike.
The COVID virus is kind of a round virus that's got lots of spikes on it, and these spikes we think are the things that latch onto our cells and infect us. So the idea is maybe if we produce a nanobody that can bind onto those spikes, or lots of those spikes, we can prevent the virus from attaching to our cells and in that way prevent infections.
So the fight against the coronavirus has come to this, a herd of llamas in an English field. It's not as unlikely as you might think. The first llama-derived drug was produced last year for the treatment of a rare blood disease, and that's triggered real optimism about similar treatments for a range of cancers, for Alzheimer's and dementia, and also now, of course, for COVID-19. The daily pace of llama life is slow, and so too the pace of scientific research. But already there are promising results, with the possibility of human trials in a year using llama nanobodies to neutralise the coronavirus. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Reading.
Well, let's go back to South Africa now, which saw its highest daily jump in coronavirus infections on Saturday. We can speak to Sanusha Naidu. She is a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, a South African think tank, and she joins us now on Skype from Cape Town. Sanusha, Saturday was the 100th day of lockdown for South Africa by my count, and you had some of the strictest measures in the world, but those are now being gradually relaxed, even as we see these case numbers skyrocket. So what's the thinking here?
Good day, Anastasia. Well, the thinking is that the stringent lockdown that took place prior to this was to actually kind of buy us time, or buy the health department and the government time in order to prepare for the peak. Now, what is happening is that there's arguments that, or rather thinking that you can't keep people in a perpetual lockdown. You need to let them be able to go out. The economy needs to start readjusting and recalibrating itself. People need to get to work. Livelihoods are being lost. I mean, like you just heard, bloodbath of unemployment in the UK. You just need to amplify that in the South African context because of our socio-economic challenges. So I think that's the thinking behind it. But also, I think what you've got to start remembering, the government wants us to start thinking about how responsible we are in our own behavior and behavioral change. So it was inevitable because there were predictions and they were told by the government experts, by epidemiologists like Professor Karim, etc., who have warned that once we reach this, open up the economy, once we reach the point where the highest infection rate, like what happened on Saturday, we have to prepare for ourselves with a peak, and this peak is now coming. And in some provinces, like where I'm based in the Western Cape, we are the epicenter, but we are beginning to see a kind of stagnation around the infection, the rate of infection, but the peak is going to be a long, drawn-out one.
How is the health system there coping, Sanusha?
Not well. All of the challenges, it's actually basically, sitting in the ICU in terms of the way it is. It's not being able to absorb the capacity. I think one of the things that, and you know this as well, is that the economic and the socio-economic conditions of our country has been so dire that even before we had such a pandemic, we knew that the health system was crumbling. And I think this pandemic just amplifies it even further.
Well, I want to ask you about some of the economic consequences you mentioned earlier as well, because it really is all part of the same issue, because the lockdown really left some of the most vulnerable people and communities struggling even to feed themselves. And I recall we even saw some people evicted from their homes during the lockdown period. We're now more than 3 months in, and the health system's crumbling. What's being done to help the most vulnerable people right now?
Well, government came up with a very, very expansive relief package, giving the unemployed a kind of 3-month grant of 350 Rand. They extended the child grant. They kind of topped up, if you want to call it that, topped up on the existing social grants that have been dispersed in order to help some of the indigent and some of the vulnerable. But I mean, that's just a stopgap measure. I think the challenge now is the companies are beginning to retrench. Some of the companies, particularly in the micro economy, they can't get back on their feet. The unemployment fund, if you saw, has also been under a specter of controversy with fraud that has been taking place. So it's really now at this point where I think it's just about how the government goes forward. We've been hearing talks about perhaps bailouts coming on for SOEs like the South African Airways, which again, is dire because we can't afford to bail out a ailing institution and an industry of that sort. But at the same time, I think what's happening is that we are going to see more and more unemployment figures rise. And at the moment, it's about 32% officially. We haven't taken into account the COVID impact.
That's a huge number. Sanusha, I do want to come back to spread now as well. And I recall that epidemiologists were warning things would get really rough in Africa. It would just take longer for the virus to get there and spread. Do you get the sense that that's now happening?
It's a difficult one, Nastasia, because I think the problem here is whether we're talking about a kind of across-the-board spread or we're talking about spread that takes place in hotspots, areas which are called circuit breakers. And I think to a large extent with the lockdown and the stringent measures of the lockdown, what we did see in South Africa is in those hotspot areas, with closing down of some of the access to spaza shops or informal shops in locations, you actually created community infection, you spiked it. So I think we're going to actually see this start to emerge more and more as we get into lockdown 2 measures, as the economy starts to open up. And that's going to be a phenomenon as we see happen in other parts of the world where as the economy starts to open up, the spikes start to spread. I think we're going to be in a peak for a long time in South Africa.
And we'll continue watching very closely here on Al Jazeera. Sanusha Naidu there from the Institute for Global Dialogue, speaking to us from Cape Town. Thank you for joining us, Sanusha. Great to get your thoughts.
Cheers, thanks.
Well, voting is currently underway in Croatia's parliamentary elections. People